The Friends of Farm Foundation program can help you further expand your network with a diverse group of food and agriculture leaders. Entry-level benefits include virtual networking sessions, while contributions at the upper levels unlock additional benefits, such as a personalized tour of our new Innovation and Education campus. Help us celebrate 90 years of making a positive impact on the future of agriculture. Visit farmfoundation.org to explore the benefits of becoming a friend and supporter of Farm Foundation today.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us today for our Farm Foundation Forum, Water Rights and Policy in Agriculture Today. We are glad to have the opportunity to engage with you and are thankful to Farm Credit for their support of this forum. My name is Martha King, and I am the Vice President of Programs and Projects at Farm Foundation, located just outside of Chicago, Illinois. I'm looking forward to today's discussion on water rights and policy, which are so top of mind for many farmers and ranchers today. Before we get into the program, I'm going to take just a few moments to share a bit more about Farm Foundation. We are a 501c3 nonprofit working at the intersection of agriculture and society to address challenges that affect the entire food and ag value chain. Specifically, we are an accelerator of practical solutions for agriculture, accelerating people and ideas into action. This year, we are celebrating 90 years of doing this work. The three levers we use to accomplish this are policy, innovation, and education. Forums such as today's are just one part of our extensive program of work, which is guided by our mission to build trust and understanding at the intersection of agriculture and society, and our vision to build a future for farmers, our communities, and our world. We rely on partnerships to fund our work and increase our impact. So if you're interested in learning more about funding or partnering with us, I invite you to reach out to explore collaboration. Now, I'd like to take a minute to highlight our Friends of Farm Foundation program. With your enrollment as a friend, you will not only be helping to support the mission and vision of Farm Foundation, but you will also gain exclusive benefits such as first reads of our issue reports, networking opportunities, and much more. Being a friend is an investment in building a better future for farmers, our communities, and our world. To learn more about being a friend of Farm Foundation, go to farmfoundation.org/friends. The link is also being posted in the chat. In addition to learning more about Farm Foundation and our work by visiting our website, I encourage you to connect with us on our social media platforms. If you are posting on social media about this morning's session, we ask that you please use #FarmFoundationForum. And now a few housekeeping notes. There will be an audience Q&A answer session at the end. We will be using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, not in the chat, to queue questions. This forum is being recorded and will be posted on our website at farmfoundation.org, as well as on our YouTube channel. We'll send out that link following today's program. When the forum concludes, you'll receive a link to a brief survey. We appreciate your feedback and your time in completing the survey. Now let's turn to today's forum topic, water rights and policy. Today's outstanding panel will provide a diversity of expertise on this topic, ranging from legal to policy to boots on the ground farmer perspectives. We'll look forward to their insights. It's now my pleasure to introduce our moderator and discussion leader, Farm Foundation Roundtable Honorary Life Fellow, Richard Morrison. Richard is a retired lawyer, priest, civic leader, and philanthropist. In law, Richard was a natural resources lawyer, principally water law, lobbyist, and educator. He continues to serve as an adjunct professor in the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law at Arizona State University. Richard is a co-founder of the Morrison Institute of Public Policy at Arizona State University. He serves on the board of directors and as a public policy committee member of the Arizona Community Foundation. In 2021, Richard founded the Institute for Public and Professional Ethics and Leadership at Northern Arizona University. Thank you for moderating our forum today, Richard.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm happy to be here, and I'm really excited to work with this panel. You know, you all have your own reasons for tuning in today, but I suppose globally, what we need to acknowledge is everywhere you go, water is an important issue. And of course, farmers, producers, ranchers all need fresh water, which is increasingly difficult to find. Clean fresh water, I might add. Globally, fresh water that humans tap worldwide goes to irrigate crops. Most of the fresh water goes to irrigate crops, and most pumped groundwater helps farmers fill the world's food baskets. If we run out of groundwater, a worldwide famine could result, given that the UN Food and Agriculture Organization estimates we need to increase global food production by up to 70% to feed the projected 9.7 billion people in 2050. So it's a very important topic. We have some wonderful panelists today. I just have a few introductory remarks. First of all, this is a seminar about water rights and policy. And it's pretty important to understand that policy impacts the exercise of water rights. And we'll see concrete illustrations of how that works in the course of this program. It's also potentially important to understand that, at least in some parts of the country, our country, the United States, what happens is not strictly the result of water rights per se. Some people have contract rights that give them the right to utilize water delivered by a major water service provider or a multi-county conservation district or something of that nature. They have contract rights. For example, in Arizona, the Central Arizona Project subcontractors were not given those contracts because they had perfected a water right under the law of prior appropriation, which prevails in the Western United States. No, the process started with the Secretary of the Interior making allocations after consultation with public officials and others in the state of Arizona. And then those who were given allocations had the choice to enter into contracts or not. Now, the other thing to acknowledge, and I'm introducing a fair amount of complexity fairly early on, but I just want you to see that water is not a simple thing to discuss or understand. One of the things that has happened is that people who were given subcontracts for Central Arizona Project water initially sometimes chose to assign those contracts to Native American communities in the context of comprehensive water rights settlements agreements. And when Congress blessed these settlements, Congress converted those contracts from a term of years to perpetual service contracts. So if you got one of the original contracts and you read it and you thought, oh, well, this person's allocation expires in 50 years, well, you might not be right about that. You have to look at the bigger picture to understand all that comes to bear on truly understanding what people can do with the contracts or the water rights which they enjoy. So I apologize for so much complexity so early on, but I really thought it was necessary to set the stage for the really, really expert panelists that we have here. And of course, just one more word. Most of you know that the Western United States is primarily under the law of prior appropriation. The Eastern United States is primarily under a law having to do with riparian rights. But also we have states that treat surface water and groundwater differently. Arizona is one of those. It's got bifurcated legal structure. Not everybody does that. More and more interest nationally is being brought to bear on the idea of integrating groundwater and surface water laws. We may see some reforms in the legal structure in future years. Well, enough from me. I am delighted to introduce Dan Tarlock as our first speaker. Dan is an internationally recognized expert on domestic and international water law. He has taught water law and written widely on prior appropriations, riparian rights, and interstate water litigation for over 50 years. He was the author of a leading treatise, excuse me, known as Law of Water Rights and Resources. I think it's been in continuous use and continuously updated from 1988 to 2021, so that was a major task. And he's also written a leading law casebook for law schools, Water Resources Management, which is now in its 8th edition. In 1988, he was the principal writer for the Western Water Policy Review Commission's report, Water in the West, Challenges for the Next Century. He is currently working on a paper on the challenges water U.S. agriculture faces adapting to climate change. Thank you for getting the conversation started. I turn it over to you.
Good morning. Yeah, are we up? We're up and running now, right?
Yes, we see you and hear you.
Okay. Good morning. I'm very honored to be asked to participate in this seminar. I've been asked to talk about water rights in the eastern United States, basically east of the Missouri River. And this is a big subject, and I'm going to give a very general overview. So let me start. We can go to the next slide. Let me say the basic point I want to make. The law has not seriously impeded irrigation or agriculture in the eastern United States for reasons that I'll explain. And it's been able to adapt to new developments. For example, supplemental irrigation in the east, primarily in the southeast, and the increased use of groundwater through high capacity pumps. But there are some developments that could and have impacted agriculture to some extent that we'll get into. So let me start with the common law. The original 13 colonies adapted the English common law, and that spread throughout the United States until the Western states started to reject it. The English common law distinguished between the use of surface water and the use of groundwater. For surface water, there was the law is called riparian rights, and what that says is that people who own land adjacent to a stream have the right to use water. So very favorable to agriculture. Originally, the English common law seemed to follow the so-called natural flow theory, that all riparians were entitled to the natural flow of the river. This worked pretty well for a mill economy, which England had. It did not work as agriculture started to withdraw water from streams, and almost all states have switched from the natural flow theory to the so-called reasonable use theory that allows any riparian to use the stream, and it's up to the courts to determine the reasonableness of the use, which really depends on the impact on other users. But the basic point is that the reasonable use theory allows diversions out of the stream and rejected the natural flow theory. All right, let's go to the next slide. The law of groundwater, especially in the East, has always been favorable to agriculture. The common law was a rule of pure capture. Anybody could sink a well and start pumping and take as much as they wanted. This led to a crisis when it was applied to oil and gas, but less so for agriculture. Almost all states, with the major exception of Texas, have limited groundwater use to reasonable use, following the surface water rules of riparian rights. This rule has had some impact on farmers because it's a rule that's basically favorable to cities. It has allowed them to develop well fields, sometimes at some distance from their urban center. And when farmers complain that water tables have been lowered, for the most part, courts have held that they're not going to prohibit cities from getting the water that they need, but they're allowed to compensate farmers for injury. The benefit of the common law is illustrated by the state of Nebraska, which follows prior appropriation for surface water but not for groundwater. The next slide, please. There's an enormous amount of groundwater irrigation in Nebraska. There have been some attempts to limit it, but Nebraska is a graphic example of how favorable the common law of groundwater has been to farmers. All right, let's go to the next slide. I think maybe you jumped to the end. Yeah, there we go. Now, having said this about the riparian rights, let me go to the problems that they have caused and how states have responded to those problems. Riparian rights are very unstable. Unlike prior appropriation, where you get a right and nobody can disturb that right if their use is after yours. In theory, in riparian rights, any new user can come along and claim that its use is reasonable and diminish or maybe even displace riparian rights. Riparian rights are also incoherent. Courts have never really been able to determine what a reasonable use is, except on a case-by-case basis. There are some factors that are common through the cases, but there's really no simple answer. Every time over the years when I've been asked to write an opinion, whether some proposed riparian use, say for a new power plant or something, was reasonable, I always ended up after a long memo saying it depends. I always felt kind of guilty, but not too much guilty of taking money for that. When you turn to groundwater, the common law rules, both capture and reasonable use, really encourage groundwater mining. So these problems begin to manifest themselves really starting in the 1950s, when you began to get droughts of some duration, maybe a forerunner of climate change. But an argument was mounted by experts and others that the common law need to be modified. And the remedy that was proposed and adopted is something called regulated riparianism. And what that is basically substituting for every riparian making a decision what is reasonable and being allowed to continue that until they're sued, is to substitute that with a permit system where you quantify the right that a riparian is entitled to. This started in Iowa in the 1950s, but Florida in 1972 adopted a very comprehensive code of water regulation, and it's still today held up as the model for regulated riparianism. And the features of it are usually time-limited permits and protection of prior uses. Sorry for the spelling errors here. I thought it was late at night. I thought I ran a spell check, but sorry. I want to make one important point about the regulated riparianism, and that is it does not displace the common law. It modifies the common law, but the common law still remains the foundation for dealing with water conflicts. And I'll give an example of that very shortly. So let's go to the next slide here. Here's a nice map that shows the differences in water rights systems. So if you look at the eastern half of the United States, there are relatively few states that this map shows that are pure common law states. Those are kind of the salmon colored states, really only 5: Ohio, West Virginia, Missouri, Tennessee, and Louisiana. But that's, oh, sorry, we have to go up to New England. That's really somewhat misleading because regulated riparianism has many variations. You start with Florida, which is quite strict for most users, but then you go to many states that only require registration of water rights rather than the registration of water use. You just have to tell the state how much water you're using. You don't actually get a permit, so that's not much of a hindrance. And beyond that, for the most part, the states that have adopted regulated riparianism have, with the exception of Florida, maybe a couple of other states, have not made much use of it. And so the common law is still in place. So let's go to the next slide. All right, let me give you an example of how agriculture has fared pretty well under regulated riparianism. I want to use South Carolina as an example. In 2017, South Carolina adopted a form of regulated riparianism, and they required permits for large users, but they exempted agriculture uses entirely, except that agriculture users had to register the amount of their withdrawal. No questions asked and no time limits on the registration. This was challenged by other riparian users, went to the South Carolina Supreme Court, and it was challenged as a violation of the public trust, as an infringement, and also an infringement on common law rights. The public trust doctrine is a whole seminar, so I won't get into that except to say the South Carolina Supreme Court did not buy the argument. They also did not buy the argument that exempting agricultural use threatened other users, but they did say to agriculture, hang on a minute, because they said, even though agricultural uses just have to be registered, they could still be challenged as unreasonable under the common law. To me, that's a graphic example of the enduring nature of the common law. So let's go to the next slide. So I just want to touch on one issue that I think has substantial implications for agriculture, and that's interstate litigation in the East. Under Supreme Court doctrine, all states that border an interstate stream have a right to make a reasonable share of that. They're entitled to an equitable apportionment. Equitable apportionment has been primarily used in the West, and it really, in the West, means protecting existing uses. But in theory, under equitable apportionment, priority is relevant, but it's not absolute. And there's a very important feature of equitable apportionment. If it turns out that a state is making an unreasonable or excessive use of water, then the responsibility lies with that state to figure out how to meet its obligations to another state, and that involves a curtailment of uses. And a lot of dispute between Kansas and Nebraska over the use of the Republican River illustrates the impact on states. But I want to talk a little bit about an interstate issue that has been going on for decades and remains unresolved, that has impact for agriculture. So let's go to the next slide if we can. There are two basins in among Georgia, Alabama, and Florida that intersect, but the main basin is the green, the Apalachicola, Chattahoochee, and Flint River Basin. And as you see, it starts in northern Georgia and goes all the way down to the panhandle of Florida. This is a dispute that maybe in its 40th year now. I'm kind of losing track of the time, but let me focus on three big uses that are at play in this use. You start at the top of the Chattahoochee Basin and you get to Atlanta. And the river is a major source of Atlanta's water supply. Then you go down to the bottom of Georgia, where there's a lot of irrigation for peanut growing. And then you get to the Delta in the Florida Panhandle, where there's a very rich and well-known oyster industry. And basically, for the years, Florida has claimed that uses upstream, both the peanut farming in southern Georgia and urban use in Atlanta, have caused the various collapses of the oyster industry. Let me go to the next slide. I think it'll be the last slide. Yeah. For years, the states had tried to negotiate an interstate compact. That fell apart. And then Florida ultimately sued Georgia in the Supreme Court for an equitable apportionment. And this just captures the gist of the case that Florida made. And it actually went to the Supreme Court twice after spending millions of dollars on lawyers' fees, experts' fees. Florida in 2021 suffered a 9-0 loss in the Supreme Court. And the court held two things. One, that Florida had not conclusively proved that Georgia's uses, primarily peanut farming. Atlanta was able to show that almost all the water that they used ultimately was returned to the stream. But Florida ultimately couldn't pin it on peanut farming. And then they were tripped up by an old equitable doctrine, unclean hands. Georgia was able to show that Florida had taken a number of steps on their own to cause the decline of the oyster industry. Nonetheless, it's an example of how agricultural use can play into interstate litigation in the East. Also, the Supreme Court more recently has held that the groundwater is subject to equitable apportionment. That had been an unresolved issue for a number of years. So that may have some impacts on supplemental irrigation. With that, I'm going to say thank you and turn it over to Richard to introduce the next speaker.
Thank you, Dan. Obviously, we don't have enough time today to give all of our panel members more time, the time that they so richly deserve. But for those of you whose appetites for more detail about the law may have been stimulated by Professor Tarlock's remarks, let me just urge you to buy his publications. They are excellent, and I promise you, you will keep them on your shelf for future reference.
Thanks, but I've already put my kids through college on the royalties.
Thank you, Dan, for all your insights.
Thank you.
Next, we're going to hear from Sarah Porter, who is director of the Kyle Center for Water Policy at Arizona State University's Morrison Institute for Public Policy. Established in 2014, the Kyle Center promotes research, analysis, collaboration, and open dialogue to build consensus in support of sound water stewardship solutions for Arizona and the West. Sarah came to the Kyle Center from the National Audubon Society, where she served as the Arizona State Director and led Audubon's Western Rivers Project, a multi-state initiative to protect and restore important river habitats in the Intermountain West. Before joining the staff of Audubon in 2006, Sarah spent 14 years as an attorney in private practice, specializing in complex commercial litigation. Thanks for joining us this morning, Sarah.
Thank you, Richard, and it's such a pleasure to be here with you all, and pretty daunting to be following Professor Tarlock on a panel. Kind of a thrill. I'm so happy to be back with the Farm Foundation. What a wonderful organization promoting understanding of issues related to agriculture. Just a little introduction of my organization. Morrison Institute for Public Policy is our umbrella organization, and it's a 40-something-year-old think tank that is dedicated to performing nonpartisan research and analysis with an understanding of the historical context in which issues emerge. And Morrison Institute focuses on policy in Arizona. I feel very lucky to live in a state that has a think tank that focuses on policy in my state. The Kyle Center focuses on water issues in Arizona and the US West. Next slide, please. One of the things that we've created that might be interesting for you to check out after the webinar, please, is an online hub of information about Arizona water resources and policy. It's called the Arizona Water Blueprint. You can just Google it and you will find it, but here's the website. And next slide, please. We have an explainer on this website that lays out issues related to the Colorado River. So if you get interested in finding out more about one of the big water issues that I'll talk about, and is one of the most urgent water challenges facing the US Southwest, you can find more information there. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk mostly about water and agriculture in Arizona, but also in the Southwest, particularly thinking about California, the Imperial Irrigation District, Palo Verde Irrigation District, and of course in Southwestern Arizona, or in Arizona. Next slide, please. So the big pressing issue that we are facing in this region currently is a problem with flows in the Colorado River. And in many respects, the Colorado River is not an impressive river. If you are from the eastern part of the United States or from other places with great, glorious rivers, you might go look at the Colorado River and think it's really not so much. But because it is one of the only rivers in an arid and semi-arid region, it's an extremely significant river to this region. 7 states and Mexico, 29 Native American tribes share water from the river. And it's responsible for the irrigation for around 5 million of agriculture. In addition, major cities from Denver to Los Angeles, Phoenix, Albuquerque, Las Vegas, Tucson, all rely, at least in part, on water from the Colorado River, so that we can say that it's an important river for some 40 million people living in the US West. Next slide, please. And currently, the big problem we're facing is that flows in the river have been declining. And this graphic is just a wonderful visualization of the problem that we're looking at. It's showing storage in the two enormous reservoirs that hold water for what is called the lower basin. That's California, Arizona, Southern Nevada, and Mexico. And these two big reservoirs, Lake Powell and Lake Mead, have been, their elevations have been persistently declining for the last 20 years. Tree ring analysis has shown that we are in the longest period of drought in 1,200 years in this region. And the drought is really driven by two main things. One is, or the problems of the, not the drought, the problems of the reservoirs is really driven by two things. One is that we're experiencing hotter and drier temperatures, particularly up in the upper Rockies, where almost most of the snowpack that results in flows in the Colorado River comes from. And this hotter, drier conditions have really changed the functionality of the system. 2 years ago, the region had average snowfall, and yet flows were only 35% of average. A year later, again, average snowfall and flows were somewhere in mid-60s, 65% or so of average. This year, the winter of 2022 and 23 has been a good year in terms of snowpack. And so we are expecting a little bit of relief in terms of reservoir storage, but it won't be enough snowpack to solve the issues that we're seeing. And another driver of the problem of declining lake levels in these reservoirs is that the system itself is over-allocated. It's been over-allocated from the start. The basic assumptions of the amount of water produced in the Colorado River were erroneous, but we didn't feel the over-allocation because various parties that had an entitlement to water or would in the future have an entitlement to water had not yet developed their entitlement. They were leaving their water in the system, if you will. And so we didn't see the effects of over-allocation until fairly recent history. In many ways, so let's go to the next slide, please. I want to caution that we should not look at urban growth as a driver of the shortage on the Colorado River. If you'll just click this slide, thanks. There was a really interesting study produced by Brian Richter and others in late 2022 that looked at the 28 largest water providers in the Colorado Basin. These are providers to some 23 million people. And the conclusions of that study were that total water demand in this period, the last 20 years, or the study period, total water demand had decreased 18% while the population had increased 24%. So for many reasons, urban growth and water demand have become decoupled, and cities are getting better and better at growing on limited supplies of water. One of the biggest tools that cities have that is not available to agriculture is that cities can drive water use indoors and then reclaim all of that water that's used. Las Vegas, in the Phoenix area and Tucson area reclaim around 93% of the water that enters the wastewater system. They treat it up to a standard and then for another use and then reuse that water. That is simply not a solution that's available to agriculture. Next slide. So, and I just thought I'd throw out this visualization that tells the same story. This is water use in central Arizona by sector. And the second line down, the darker blue line, is the agricultural sector. And you can see that there's been a decline in demand over this 20-year, almost 18-year period, 19-year period. And then the third line from the top, the orange line, is municipal demand. And you can see that it's gently sloping up. The way the math works out is that in this period, the central Arizona cities grew by 45%, but water demand went up only 14%. And that was with very little in terms of regulations that would push municipal demand down. Next slide. So now we're coming to the big challenge. We're looking at declining flows on the Colorado River, and that means we have to figure out a way to leave water in the system. In fact, the reservoirs are so imperiled, Lake Mead and Lake Powell, Glen Canyon Dam, Hoover Dam, that the United States Bureau of Reclamation, which manages the system, has told water users in the Colorado Basin that they need to figure out a way to leave 15 to 25% of the water in the system to enable those reservoirs to stabilize and avoid getting to the point where they would no longer produce hydropower, or the even more potentially catastrophic point where they would hit dead pool and water couldn't be delivered off the reservoirs. This is how the argument is sort of shaping up. And my graphic is here to tell this big story. Agriculture is responsible for about 3/4 of consumptive use of water in the Colorado Basin. This is Colorado River water. And municipals and industrial users are responsible for only about 1/4 of the consumptive use of water, of Colorado River water. By the same token, agricultural water users tend to have very senior rights. So Professor Tarlock talked about the doctrine of prior appropriation, which roughly, it's not exactly, but roughly governs the Colorado River system and Colorado River entitlements. And so at this point where we're looking for water supplies to leave in the system, it's really coming down to an argument by lower priority users, meaning cities, that higher priority users, meaning agriculture, should leave water in the system. There are many arguments being made currently that they should be compelled to leave water in the system. Some of the justifications for going outside of priority or the rule of prior appropriation are that the system, the actual hydrologic systems need to have water in them. And so there's a theory that the Bureau of Reclamation has kind of an emergency authority to keep water running in the systems, even if that water would be delivered to lower priority users. There's an argument that there's a health and safety sort of theory that the Bureau of Reclamation could deliver water to users if their health and safety depended on it, even if those deliveries would not be consistent with priority. And finally, and I think of maybe more interest in this conversation, is an argument that some agricultural uses of water are wasting water, or in the legal terms, don't qualify as beneficial uses. And so there's an argument that the Bureau of Reclamation or the Secretary of Interior, who's the boss of the Bureau of Rec, would have the authority to decrease water deliveries to agricultural users who are wasting or not making beneficial use of their water. Next slide. And so when we talk about beneficial use, it's really interesting. This is really in the realm of theory, but it's very much an emerging conversation. One of the things that people are looking at these days is what are farmers growing with the water resources. And here's a breakdown of what is being used, how water is being used to grow stuff in my state, in the state of Arizona. And I also thought it was interesting to juxtapose the market value of crops to the acreage for crops. And what you see here is that more than 350,000 acres in Arizona are being dedicated to growing forage. Another almost 200,000 acres are being dedicated to growing cotton. Those are very high water use crops, and they are fairly low margin in terms of cash, market value. A much smaller amount of acreage is dedicated to growing vegetables, and yet vegetables are a high value crop compared with forage and cotton. And so it's this kind of data that is informing this emerging theory that crop choice might be a factor in consideration of what is a beneficial use of water as required for the use of water for agriculture. Beneficial use is required for any water use pretty much anywhere in the West. And I'll take a moment also to say that when there's pressure on one water system, there is inevitably a knock-on effect on other water systems, not only physically that people turn to other water supplies when one supply is short, but also I think in the political conversation or the public conversation. And there's a very heated conversation currently in the state of Arizona about the use of groundwater for farming, and particularly the use of groundwater for growing alfalfa. There have been national headlines about a Saudi-owned farm in central Arizona that is using groundwater in a region that receives very little rain, 4 to 5 inches per year of rain. And it's a hot political issue, fueled in part because of the provenance of the farm ownership, and fueled in part because of concerns that people have in the region that their own residential wells will go dry as a result of the impressive demand imposed on the aquifers by an industrial scale agricultural use. And so this argument has gotten so big, and I'm hoping you'll be able to see this, that alfalfa is really being demonized here in Arizona. So I thought, and I mean, we're really having this, my background is messing it up, but I'm wearing my I Heart Alfalfa shirt that is now available to order from the Maricopa County Farm Bureau. I'm back. I'll try to make that show up better. Because of how public and how vivid this conversation is, you can buy t-shirts that are pro or con alfalfa. Again, the reason I think it's important to bring this argument up is that the choice of growing alfalfa by a farmer is a rational choice based on a farmer's water rights and water availability, based on a healthy market for alfalfa. And to me, the conversation is very misplaced. It misses what the real issues are, but instead, this one has a lot of fuel. Let's go to my last slide, please. I'll stop there with my comments, and I look forward to hearing from the other panelists and to our discussion. Thank you. Richard, I think you're muted.
Thank you for that. Yes, I was. Sorry. Thank you, Sarah. And to all of you who've been listening to Sarah, let me just remind you that you have access to the Kyle Center website, an excellent website with all kinds of information and reports, which from my point of view actually would be applicable far beyond the bounds of Arizona, if only as a model for what might be done in other states, but certainly I think in the arid West. Well, we move now to Matt Moreland. And then we'll have our Q&A session, as you know, and hopefully you all have questions that you've been saving. Matt Moreland is a Farm Foundation Roundtable Fellow and a fourth generation farmer and owner of Moreland Farms, which is a 15,000 acre farm in north central Oklahoma, an hour south of Wichita, Kansas. He's predominantly a no-till farmer. He grows winter wheat, corn, cotton, and soybeans. He has 3 sons who joined the farm operation, which also includes a cow-calf herd and an excavation construction business. I think you can get the picture. He's a busy guy. Adopting regenerative agricultural practices starting in 1996, Matt uses precision agricultural strategies on his farm, such as sophisticated irrigation system, digital weather sensors, and continuous soil sampling. We look forward to hearing from you, Matt. Take it away.
All right, I'm happy to be part of this panel. I am the non-lawyer. I have paid for a law degree through this little lawsuit and water dispute I'll tell you about. So this is a picture of a river that we irrigate from. This was taken in the summer of 2012. To kind of frame around this whole picture and give you our environment of what was happening at that time, that was when the big fracking horizontal drilling came to our area. And when we've had water rights that go back to 1972 and 1979 are our oldest. A slew of temporary permits were granted by the Oklahoma Water Resources Board to companies like Chesapeake, Sandridge, Shell, Devon, and they would be upstream from us, downstream, anywhere, but temporary permits are just quick, you pay the money, and I don't believe there's much analysis. So that coupled with a drought put us in a very low flow water situation. I'm going to back up just another few years prior to that. In 2010, downstream, we had a neighbor want to start irrigation. He bought his irrigation center pivot system before he had water rights. He learned that he had to apply for water rights. The city downstream, Blackwell, Oklahoma, protested his water right. There have been protests throughout years. Again, Oklahoma does have different water rights between groundwater and river surface water. The surface water is the state's water. So this city protested that man's water rights, and he agreed to a level on a dam where this city diverts water, that if the water quit going over that dam, he would quit irrigating. So why that's key is a few years later, that comes back to us because that city kind of got a taste of, hey, maybe we can worry and put some pressure on irrigators upstream. So again, we go through a drought in 12 and 13. At one point in 2013, the city downstream had a little trouble with pumping out of the river when they needed to. So in February of 2014, that city hires a large law firm in Oklahoma City and sends demand letters to 4 families that irrigate upstream from them, that they believe they have proof that we are infringing in their 1933 and their 1981 water rights. The demand letter stated if we don't agree, sign this, that they would take us to court. And what they'd already spent quite a bit of money with the engineer looking at the stream flows, and they used USGS stream gauges, one that's about 20 miles upstream from where we divert water from, and another stream gauge that was about 25 miles downstream. And a little quick analysis, you can go online and see our stream flows. We learned that June, July, and August, we would not be able to divert any water. And those are our pumping times. That's our crop growing with corn, soybeans, high use time. So I've told Richard this experience. I hired a large law firm to defend us, and that's how this conversation came about. You build trust and belief. These people defended us well, and we learned a lot along the way. So in May of 2014, we went before the district court, and the city was trying to put a temporary injunction on us, and the court said, no, we don't see that right now, but we will go to trial. So we moved ahead. ended up in trial in June of 2014. One other family downstream that had about 300 acres of irrigation, they decided to go in with us, and we decided to go 50-50 on our costs. And we were quickly told that, if this goes to trial like it did, we would spend $100,000 easily. But we were committed that we wanted to defend our water rights, and we believed that we had the rights to these water and that we weren't infringing on the city's water right. So we go to court. Things go pretty well there, I would say. The best thing that happened is when you go to court through discovery, you get all their records. And we learned one thing: they'd hired an engineering firm because they had been worried about their water situation. And they paid that engineering firm $100,000 to tell them, and we got the document that said they did not have a water problem, that they had a declining population in this small town, and they'd gone from using 3,000 acre feet a year to about 1,500 acre feet a year. They were provided a WPA project dam in 1933 that held 3,000 acre feet. They were built a 1,000 acre holding pond, off-stream holding pond, that could hold the 1,000 acres feet, and they had another diversion dam for that too. That's their pumping station. And then in between in the 1950s, they had a 400 acre feet dam built, and that was allowed to be washed out and never repaired. So everything we could see, it just showed they had a lot of water available to them. And honestly, when they thought they were running out of water, they had a lot in storage that would take them through the rest of the year, even if they could never divert another gallon of water from this river. So we did get through, and the judge ruled in our favor that first go around. They appealed with the state Supreme Court, who did send it back to district court on some small pieces of whether the state's water rights still pertain. There's they had a 1950s case that kind of before Oklahoma water rights appropriation system came about, that they being the city of Blackwell kept referring to, that gave them run of the river, that they have 100,000 acre feet of water available to them. And again, I'm not a lawyer. I don't know the Oklahoma laws well. I just listened to them argued by some great attorneys. As we moved on, then we kept going back and forth, and we were disappointed when we learned also through discovery that Blackwell, the city, had not been properly reporting their water use each year. And our belief is that the city is held to the same standards as we farmers are, that it's the state's water, and if we don't use it, you lose it. So over a 7-year rolling period, if you don't use your maximum allotted amount, you get brought back down to what you use, the maximum used in that 7-year period. There was a 10-year period that Blackwell never reported any water right use. So to us, they, through the law, the statutes, they have lost that water right. So we filed a declaratory judgment with the Water Resources Board asking for a judgment on what the actual water rights that they possess are. At that same time, another move was thinking that they may get reduced. We and the other family downstream, we had enough riparian acres that we could go ahead and apply for the rest of the water rights that were available between the city and the state line. This photo on the screen is 1 mile from the Kansas state line. So this is in Oklahoma looking north. In doing that, unfortunately, though, we've got a quick letter back from the Water Resources Board staff attorney that they don't really look at cities' water use. And if they do, they might do it on a stream by stream area. And our area was not a focus to them. And I have the letter printed out beside me here, and it stated also that that's a very tight subject, and we would have to go very carefully to look at reducing a city area ever. Well, both our family and the other family that we went to court with, we'd both been reduced because we would send the true and appropriate water reports, and some wet years, over a 7-year period, we did not use that much water. So it kind of feels like there's a double standard here of what we deal with. So moving ahead, we get to that level of, yes, the attorneys are making a lot of money on us. And honestly, by the time this was settled, we'd spent $250,000 on our side. And the city, with their experts and all, they spent nearly $700,000 on this. So we had a big push when we could get together with the members of the city board and ourselves. We were working towards a settlement agreement. We thought we had a settlement agreement going in 2015. We had an agreement, we'd written it out. We took it back to attorneys, and all of a sudden it came back not saying anything like we'd agreed and very one-sided for the city. So looked like we were back in court again. When we filed for our extra water rights, the city of Blackwell also failed to see that in the papers, because you are required to publish it. It's a legal notice. And the State Water Resources Board started acting and granting us those water rights. And the city sued the Water Resources Board and us, saying that they needed, because they have the run of the river, that they should have been giving specific notice from the Water Resources Board that there were new water rights being applied for within that basin. That never went to court, because as we did continue to move along, we did reach a settlement agreement in late 2017. And it took a lot of going back and forth. I think we learn in law that you don't always win. You know, the win is somewhere a mix where both sides feel a little pain and you can maybe claim a small victory. But we did agree to a level on their diversion dam, that if the water ever got that low, that we would reduce our withdrawals by 50% at a first level, and then we would completely shut off at another level. So it was all based on that downstream dam. The problem with that is my granddaughter's great grandkids will wonder someday why we agreed to it. The other problem is the fact that that city did have a 3,000 acre foot dam in between their diversion point and where we divert from upstream of that dam, that the dam doesn't function. It holds 3,000 acre feet, but doesn't have gates that open and allow that water to go down. The other problem is that off-stream holding pond, when a city uses 1,400 acre feet a year, but can hold 1,000 acre feet, that honestly, by April or May, they don't need to divert any more water. If it was a farmer, we would be forced to use that water until we deplete that basin and then start the next calendar year's pumping again. So I guess just my piece of this is explaining that agriculture, we do have a big piece on our shoulder that, as Sarah just showed, we're a huge water user. And when you start talking to cities about the volume of water we use compared to a city's water use, it's a tough argument. On the other piece of that, that city also would put back on us several times, well, you guys are making profits from this water, and we're just trying to water and provide water for the people of the city. That's a little disingenuous, because it's one of the big profit centers for the city are their utilities and their markup on their water. Yes, it is. I mean, it plays well with the public. It's our water. We shouldn't, but we do get that pushback in agriculture that you guys are a profit center and the cities are not. So that kind of wraps up what, my little quick and dirty piece of this, that of where we got to and how we got to this. And the settlement was kind of the key. I think we could have kept fighting, and to get a city council that changes every election period to understand what their water use is, where their water comes from, how their water system works. And then again, also, teaching a district court judge something that maybe they just kind of overlooked or had a quick class or two in college about water law. There's just a lot of moving pieces if you wanted to keep fighting and thinking that you were going to pull it off and win. But I think the good way to how we settled it was to find an agreement that we could all agree on and that would work for the city and work for ourselves. Feel free to roll back to Richard then. And
Well, thank you very much, Matt. I found that a fascinating story, and I urged him to tell the entirety of it. Because, of course, producers, be they farmers or ranchers, are often confronted with the difficulty of having to figure out how to finance litigation when push comes to shove. and there's no other resolution, and you find yourself in court, is a very expensive process. And I think just before we get into the public Q&A, Sarah, I might even ask you to summarize for our listeners some of the reason why we are still in a general stream adjudication in Arizona that's been going on since 1974, and without having finally adjudicated even a single water rights claims among tens of thousands of claimants, many of whom are complaining about the cost of being in this proceeding in the first place.
Yeah, good. I was thinking about that too, Richard. So for everyone participating, a general stream adjudication is a court proceeding to set the priority, to catalog the priority and quantity and other aspects of every water right in a watershed. And Arizona has two. These watersheds cover most of Arizona, certainly the bottom half and then the upper northeastern quarter. And they have been going on for well over 40 years. And one important reason is that water is so critical that everything about the adjudication requires a huge fight. But I would say the adjudications in Arizona required novel water law. It brought up, the adjudications have raised issues of water law that had never been raised before. And some of the biggest issues related to the state court's jurisdiction over water rights of federal claimants, including tribes, national parks, US forests, military bases, you name it. And those, in the big picture, I would say that if we could go back, we probably wouldn't choose a court proceeding as the method of resolving all of the surface water rights. We would probably come up with a different way of doing it, at least for the small water rights holders. But the adjudication, both of these big adjudications they stand in the way of clarity about water rights, which is really critical for people to be able to plan for their own water needs in the future.
Dan, would you like to address from your perspective, how some of the other states have dealt with either formalized water adjudications in the court system, or perhaps dealt with the controversies about relative priorities through an administrative process?
Well, I mean, all adjudications are gifts to lawyers because they go on forever. I think some states have had more success than Arizona. I think Idaho managed to finish up the Snake River adjudication. Montana has, on some basins, has had pretty good success. But I agree that I've never been a big fan of general stream adjudications because there are too many uncertainties in water rights that they never deal with them.
Yes, and one of the reasons why it's taken so long in Arizona is that hydrographic survey reports get released to all of the claimants, and they start checking out everybody else's claims and trying to figure out how to attack those claims. And then you end up in a series of little miniature trials inside the adjudication proceeding, where essentially one neighbor is litigating against another neighbor, saying, yeah, well, you're claiming an early priority, but mine's earlier than yours, and you don't have any evidence, and my evidence is better than yours, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, you can imagine the frustration in the courts having to deal with all the minutia that comes up in the context of these little disputes. And sometimes they're over a very small amount of water. So that legal proceeding is perhaps not the ideal way of proceeding, as Sarah said. I see we're getting quite a number of questions showing up in the Q&A, and I think we want to move to that shortly. Remember, you can print your questions in the Q&A, or you can, I suppose, raise your hand. Hopefully I'll get some implication or indication of that from Martha or somebody. I don't know. I don't see any of the audience, of course. And so if you raise your hand, I may not see that. So the chat is probably the better way to go. Um, Anyway, I do want to, you know, at the end of this thing, I think the seminar will just sort of suddenly end. So I don't want to lose my opportunity to thank all of our speakers for insightful discussion today. And of course, I want to thank all of you in the audience, of which there are, you know, lots of people today who have joined us. We very much appreciate your engagement with us and would love to hear your feedback. So please take a moment at the end to share your comments about today's session in the brief survey. Martha, any other comments before we go to Q&A?
Oh, you can go right ahead, Richard.
Okay. Well, all right. Panelists, I don't know whether you've opened your Q&A or your chat. I guess I'm going to start with the Q&A, and I see a question specifically addressed to you, Sarah. Maybe you're reading it for yourself, but for the benefit of all the people in the audience, the question is whether she would speak to the implications or the policy challenges presented by the concept that beneficial use of irrigation water means agencies can tell farmers what they can or cannot grow. The comment is that this seems like potentially a much bigger issue than the profitability of various crops.
Yeah, I really appreciate the question. Thank you, Laura Campbell. I think it's a fraught area. It would be worrisome if someone other than the grower, who's the expert on the crop choice, were making the call about what to grow. And that's really why I've chosen to focus on what I'm calling the demonization of alfalfa. If we have a problem with the amount of water that's allocated to farmers, then let's work on that problem, but not focus on crop choice itself. And realistically, in the realm of surface water rights, the grower is going to use his available inputs to grow and make a profit, you know, and in accordance with all the regulations and all of that. And reducing the amount of alfalfa consumed or shrinking the alfalfa market is not a good way to reduce the amount of water that a grower is using in a hot, dry place like Imperial Valley or Yuma, Arizona. It's not the crop. The issue is the water policy that is giving that grower the opportunity to use all that water. So, but I agree, I think, with the implication of the question that it would really be problematic to have agencies decide what farmers should grow.
Thank you for that. Matt, here's a question that's popped up that I think maybe you should try to answer at least first in sequence. How do you go about evaluating the risk of crop failure due to water shortages? And then how do you plan to mitigate those risks in your farming operation?
Yeah, it's become important because we are feeling some change in our climate where we have extended dry periods. We're just coming off of one right now with rain coming today. On our own farms, you know, no-till's been very important for us. Also, irrigation technology has improved so much of how we can control systems, center pivot systems. You know, remotely, electronically, every degree can be sped up, slowed down as they come around. Another piece we're working with is ground penetrating radar with an Israeli company, Autonomous Pivot, that as our systems go around, that ground penetrating radar is learning our soil every rotation the pivot makes and letting us know if we have excess water or not. But unfortunately, through the way the water rights are set up, if we don't use that maximum amount in that 7-year period, we'll lose it. So another piece we need to figure out policy-wise is if we start shedding and saving water, that we aren't penalized later for not using as much water, that we have more available to use maybe somewhere else or another way. But it is tough as you know, you can see maybe a drought coming. It's tough with the systems because we typically set a pumping ability up to meet the maximum water needs of that crop at its highest water use point. So corn, right at the grain fill period, using 3 to 4 tenths inch of water a day. As our climate has gotten hotter and we're drier too, we can have evapotranspiration rates pushing a ½ inch a day. So, we're adding water, so our ability to store it in the soil gets more difficult all the time to get ahead enough and store it. So that would be one mitigating way, is to try to, where people pre-water or put a bank of water in your soil going in, knowing that you may be shutting off. One other piece that we've been pushed to and we're looking at doing more of is off-stream holding ponds. As we get more of these big rains that come in at times, build a structure and hold more water, and then move that water to our system when we don't have it in the regular streams.
Yeah. Matt, are there elements of commodity programs, or are there insurance products that you purchase to help you offset the risks of a drought?
Yes, but in federal crop insurance, it's a great program, and I really think it's one of the best, rather than working through disaster relief programs. It's the great way to handle farmers' highs and lows. But loss of water is not a crop loss that can be paid for. If you don't have the water, you have an irrigated history in corn, and that year the reason you had a loss was because you didn't have the water. That's not an insured loss. So it's multi-peril, and they don't consider that a peril if you ran out of water before the season was over.
Yeah. And Dan, you're studying the effect of climate change on Western agriculture, and it's obvious that there's a huge expectation that agriculture will come up with new ways of conserving large quantities of water. In other words, conservation is going to get much more attention. There are a lot of things that we can do, of course, but technology tends to be quite expensive, particularly if we're talking about lining systems and so forth. One of the things that's often said about the problem with conservation is that if you find a way not to use the water to which you are entitled, somebody else will use it. And so maybe there's no real net savings to the system. Do you find that to be the case all over the United States?
Well, that's always been a concern, mainly with prior appropriation. I think some states have addressed that by allowing you to conserve and then market the saved water. That's one way to do it. But in terms of adaptation to climate change, it's going to be more than conservation. There's a lot of research starting in how to develop more resistant crops. For example, that may be promising for something like cotton. The other thing that I just want to say is I've always thought that agriculture was hampered because we don't have a national agricultural policy. Now, maybe farmers don't want that, but when you get a question of foreign ownership of farms, as the Saudis have invested, we don't have any national way of dealing with that. I think hard choices are going to be made. Beneficial use is not the route, but I think it would be good to have to start a discussion of an agricultural policy, what it might look like, and how it might benefit agriculture.
Yeah.
But that's a pet hobby horse of mine.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Sarah, back to you. We've had a question about whether you or anybody else on the panel sees a way forward to solve the interstate conflicts over Colorado River appropriations. You want to tackle that first?
Sure. I think believe it or not, I'm kind of optimistic that that there will be resolution. And part of the reason I'm optimistic is because things have gotten really bad, and we have faced how bad it could be. and that is that motivates people in the direction of collaboration and cooperation. But there are a lot of creative solutions short of just cutting water. And one is to move money from cities to farms in exchange for water supplies. That's what Metropolitan Water District of Southern California has been doing with the Palo Verde Irrigation District, where farmers are paid to rotationally fallow in order to ensure a reliable water supply for Southern California cities. I think over time, there will be more interest by cities in voluntary retirement, let's say, of agriculture along the main stem, where that agriculture, where there's a desire by those farmers. By the same token, we've seen a lot of conflict arise, particularly in the state of Arizona, in connection with attempts by cities to acquire water rights associated with farms on the Colorado River, because the communities in those areas are very, very resistant to having water transferred away from those regions and transported to central Arizona. I think in the big picture, in terms of the interstate conflict, we're at an unusual moment where there's quite a lot of funding available, and money is really the key ingredient to getting people to voluntarily leave water in the system, and to creating innovative programs that result in water being left in the system. But it's not easy, and in the end, Arizona will continue to take the biggest cut, especially central Arizona, because CAP water users are junior in priority to other users in the lower basin.
I think a lot of people are anticipating litigation over whatever action the Secretary of the Interior takes to cut water use on the Colorado. And that litigation will possibly focus principally on the extent of secretarial authority. There are law cases that could be examined to try to answer the question of whether there's a boundary around that authority of some sort. Dan, would you care to comment on your own view about the extent of secretarial authority in regulating the flow of Colorado River?
Yeah, a little bit of context. In the original Arizona-California litigation, the special master, Judge Simon Rifkin, proposed that in times of shortage, the Boulder Canyon entitlements to the states would be used to figure out the proportions. So under that system, California would have a bigger share of dealing with shortages compared to Arizona because they have more water. Now, the Supreme Court rejected that, and everybody has looked at that 1963 opinion. It doesn't really give any guidance to the secretary, as far as I could tell. There are choices that could be made. You could go back to Judge Rifkin's proposal, for example. The other thing that just to keep in mind, as far as I know, the secretary has no authority to deal with the upper basin. Arizona versus California only dealt with the 3 states. So any effort there would definitely be challenged, because there's nothing in the compact and there's no congressional apportionment of the upper basin. They did it themselves in the 48 compact.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. And I don't know how well the audience is familiar with the relationships between the upper basin and the lower basin, but I assure you, everybody in the lower basin is hoping for some relief in some form from upper basin users. Well, let's see. There is a question that's been posed that focuses really primarily on water rights enjoyed by tribal nations, and what steps can be done to secure their water rights. A lot of that's already been accomplished. Somebody can explain that, or perhaps I could tackle it. But in any event, there's a smaller and more focused question that's also been appended to the first one about tribal water rights, and that is whether anybody would like to comment on the current Navajo Nation case. Let's start perhaps, I don't know, Sarah, why don't you talk a little bit about tribal water rights?
Yeah, so when we have a doctrine called the Winters Doctrine that says that when the government creates a reservation, a tribal reservation or a reservation of land for another purpose, it impliedly reserves sufficient water to carry out the purposes of the reservation. So that means that Native American tribes that have reservations have a water right. The problem is that it is left to the tribe to prove up the water right, and there's a long history of the failure of the federal government to prosecute tribal water rights claims or to allow tribes to prosecute their claims. But in different tribes are at different places, and I can speak most knowledgeably about Arizona. We have 22 tribes, and just shy of half have settled their water rights claims. Often tribes will have multiple claims from different systems, different surface water systems, also groundwater. We have another group of tribes, of those 22 tribes, that have settled some of their claims. And then we have another group of tribes that have not settled their water rights claims. The status of tribal water rights depends or varies from tribe to tribe. And I won't even comment on the recent Navajo Nation case that was argued in the U.S. Supreme Court, but I'd love to hear Professor Tarlock on that.
No, I don't. I haven't followed that closely enough to say that, but I would like to say one thing about the tribal water rights. When the Winters case was decided early in the 20th century, the assumption was that Indians should be, quote, civilized by becoming farmers, like the white settlers around them. And for decades, people in the West argued that Winters' rights were irrigated agriculture, and then they didn't fund much Indian irrigation. Over the last 20 years or so I think there's been an expansion of a tribal water right going toward a notion of a homeland so that it fits the tribe. Now, that's come to roost in the Klamath Basin, where the tribe has rights to maintain endangered species. So I think that's an important point about the evolution of Winters' rights.
Yeah. I'll just
if I could just add, oh, sorry, Richard. I was just going to add very quickly that two of Arizona's tribes have very substantial Colorado River allocations, one through an adjudication and one through settlement. And they are really major players in the Colorado River negotiations, not only in Arizona, but even multi-state. And so we often think of the Navajo Nation, which has yet to prove its Colorado River claim or other water rights claims in Arizona. But we have tribes that are in a completely different situation. Some of the most water rich or water powerful entities in the state of Arizona are those two tribes.
Yeah. I'll just say briefly about the Navajo Nation case. I've heard a briefing about it. And according to my understanding, the issue that the Supreme Court is going to decide is a fairly narrow issue. It really focuses on the extent to which the secretary has a fiduciary responsibility to the tribe. to do all the things the tribe would like to have done. It will not decide, as I understand it, it will not decide, for example, where the water is supposed to come from to satisfy the winner's rights claim. That will be decided in another forum on another day. So we're all watching it with great interest, but the decision that will come down from the pending case will not be the end of that story. So we'll have to stay tuned. And now we've had a question that is kind of interesting to me, that focuses on the question of, is there a failure of markets at work, in the sense that water perhaps is not being used in a manner that is most productive and most valuable to society. In other words, economists routinely will say, well, water needs to go to the highest and best use. And in most states, there's some sort of statutory priority system which will identify the priorities. But even without reference to any body of law, everybody probably has some notion about what the highest and best use is. But you will get controversy over whether water is such a basic human right for people wherever they live that it would be unethical, in essence, for water to be transported away from those areas to in the direction of deep pockets that can afford to transport it, treat it, and deliver it at a higher price to other users. Do any of you as panelists want to take up this question of whether water should go to the highest and best use?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really tough one that the West has been wrestling with for 30 or 40 years now. In the longer, sorry. It's really the 60s. The economists came in and said, basically, there's too much alfalfa. Sorry about that. You got to go to higher uses, and that, of course, has allowed cities to kind of break the unspoken agreement with agriculture that they wouldn't take too much water, and you've had a lot of transfers to urban uses, which would definitely satisfy the economist. It's a greater dollar value, I think. But nobody has really tackled the question of so-called third-party effects on people who don't have actual water rights. But these communities, been a lot of concern about it, but not much has been done. I do think just the one thing, the Las Vegas lost this big case in eastern Nevada, where they wanted to go in and take water to Las Vegas, and the court ruled against them. That's an interesting, very interesting precedent, because that's really the first time I think that a rural area has gotten some legal backing for keeping its water.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Maybe we need to take one step back. I just noticed another question popping up in the Q&A window that also relates to tribal water rights. And the observation is made that some tribes, have recognized water rights, but they don't necessarily have the means to put the water to work. And what can be done to help them achieve the full use of their entitlement, or perhaps get greater efficiency out of the use of the water that they are applying to their lands. I'd like to just quickly reference that I personally participated in 4 comprehensive settlements of Indian water rights claims during the years in which I was practicing law. As one of the negotiators, I was, at the tables, and it was very obvious to all of us who were negotiating that one of the only reasons that a tribe would be inclined to compromise its water rights claims at all is because these settlements came with the financial wherewithal to put the water to use. Now, a lot of it came from the federal government, and that was funded pursuant to federal trustees' responsibility for Indian lands, reservations, not just Indian lands, but federal reservations. So in other words, because you have to build storage works or diversionary works and transportation works, and sometimes install application efficiency for irrigating crops, it takes a lot of money. And settlements are one way to achieve the purpose, because the tribes are going to end up with quite a lot of water and quite a lot of money. But the tribes who've not found a way to enter into settlements or have decided those are not in their best interest will probably continue to face some financial struggles. Let's see what else we've got in the Q&A. I don't want to overlook anybody, but it could happen, of course. It's the nature of the beast.
If while you're looking, I could add that most of the tribal settlements, I think all of the tribal settlements in Arizona include provisions that permit the tribe to lease water, and so lease their water. And so many cities in central Arizona are leasing substantial amounts of water from tribes. And that is one a revenue producing resource that may help tribes then develop the infrastructure to use their own water resources. It also may become impossible to use their water because the revenue from the lease is so important, or because the prospect of then canceling the lease has repercussions that the tribe doesn't want to deal with.
Excellent point. Well, we have a question that's related to, we might call it water equity in part. Well, of course, we've been a part of an ongoing discussion today and previously about urban uses against agriculture. But the question that I'm seeing in the window, it focuses on quality of life considerations. Are we considering future generations, et cetera? Now, it just so happens that there's about to be a big legal panel in next month in Arizona addressing equity in water. And I believe, Sarah, you're going to be on that panel. You may have some thoughts you would like to share initially. I would like to just point out that equity means different things to different people. Sometimes it means access to the resource. Sometimes it means access to the decision-making process that will lead to the utilization of the resource. And then, sometimes people just look at the results in terms of who is using the water and who doesn't have access to the water at all. But virtually every system of economic justice that I've ever studied in my life would say that one of the major principles of economic justice is making provisions for future generations. I have seen that principle applied in the context of our Indian water right settlements. I don't often hear it articulated explicitly in other settings, but I'm pretty sure it's never far from anybody's consciousness because in between negotiating sessions, there are all kinds of voices weighing in on the need to make provision for future generations. So with that introduction, would anybody else like to talk about water equity? In the broadest possible sense, maybe. Yeah.
Because of the vagaries of water policy in central Arizona, there's particular pressure on water supplies for home building. There are just some various things happening that are making home builders worry that there won't be water for home building. Another word for the kind of home building that I'm talking about is sprawl. It's building homes in areas that previously were not urbanized. And I've been kind of trying to restrain myself from smiling when I hear the advocates of changing policy to make sure that there's water for the home building industry. They invoke equity, that it's not equitable, that this industry, should suddenly find itself being the one industry that's hurting because of water supply challenges. Which is all to say that I think I agree. Of course, my life is all about thinking about future generations, and I appreciate what you said, Richard, that comes up, and I think it's really interesting to think about it coming up during settlement negotiations. But equity really is in the eye of the beholder, and I don't think equity by itself is it's not very informative for policy. I do think it's a good question, and we need to make sure that as we implement policies or make recommendations for changing policies, that we think to what are the implications for everybody in the system, and what are the implications for future generations.
Yeah, thank you. Now, Matt, I'm going to turn to you on this next question, at least initially, and then other panelists may want to weigh in. But Amanda Martin apparently has a farm in Nebraska, and not that far away from you. And she is concerned about the current status of the waters of the United States controversy. She's asking us to comment on what we think lies ahead and think about the interface between federal, state, and local jurisdiction for such issues. I don't personally know about state regulation of water quality issues. I emphasize state regulation of water quality issues in your state or in Nebraska for that matter. But do you have waters of the U.S. Difficulties? Does your farm community in Oklahoma face this issue in a big way?
Yes, we do. As you mentioned in my bio, we do a fair bit of work, not just on our own land, but maybe, for some other people around. And they're called blue lines that extend several miles from what I would call a navigable stream. That river picture you had up, I have that you can't float a canoe in that, but 7 miles from there are blue lines that come across some of our agricultural fields. And for those, you can go to your local NRCS office and say, hey, I need to build a waterway in this stream that's this little intermittent canal, that intermittently in a rainstorm will have water flow in it. But we have to go through the Corps of Engineers and ask if we can change that, to work in there. One of their key phrases is a one-step removal process, to where if you dip, even though this is a dry stream, if you dip out of that dry stream, the dirt is to be placed out of the stream bank channels, and very limited to how you can move it. Sometimes for farming efficiency, we would want to move a meandering ditch across a quarter mile of a field, half mile of a fields, maybe even move it over to the side of the field or square it up and make it straight. And you can't deviate very far, if at all, from where that existing line lays. It's also a big question of the whether there's a wetland on the farm. The NRCS has determinations. That's a federal government, but state, local control. But they're also, the Corps of Engineers can come in and have a different opinion all alone of themselves. That you may think you're not dealing with a wetland after you ask NRCS, but the Army Corps of Engineers can and will have a different opinion at times. With that said, I have to say that was one thing I learned in our water dispute, because the downstream city threw a lot at us, that our Corps out of the Tulsa division was great to work with. They taught me a lot. And in fact, right now we have an application before them for more of a operating understanding agreement, that we understand that waters of the U.S. is the law. We have to operate within that space. And if we go in and want to build a waterway, here are the procedures we're going to need to do. So
Yeah.
you can work with them, but boy, is that WOTUS rule, it seems like it reaches out a long ways, farther than what I would have believed the lawmakers would understand, that where the function should have ended.
Now, probably everybody on this call really understands this, but this very focused discussion we're having on a definition of the waters of the United States relates to the application of the Clean Water Act. And that's why I mentioned water quality more generally. Now, here's a really intriguing question that's come in, and Professor Tarlock, this may be the next area for your analytical mind to take on as a focused research. I'm going to read this because it's really hard to paraphrase. There's increasing interest in water electrolysis to produce hydrogen, particularly using renewable energy or green energy. Areas with abundant wind and solar potential often overlap areas that use water for agricultural purposes. Since electrolysis essentially destroys a water molecule versus agriculture use, in which water is returned via the water cycle, are there different legal principles that apply to electrolysis? And if not, should there be?
Oh boy, I mean, well, let me, I mean, ultimately, a lot of water never returns to the stream. It goes into a product. A crop is a product. So you might say that that's the same thing. We've never never objected to water being lost through a product. So anyway, that would be my first take.
Yeah. Okay. Anybody else look at this issue? It's not one that I have examined.
I think it's the question of hydrogen power production is going to be the next big alfalfa fight. It really, it's very much seen as part of the hydrogen is seen as part of the transition to a lower carbon economy, and even places like Arizona are going to need to be able to produce hydrogen if we have, for example, a national trucking fleet based on hydrogen, as many people are projecting. And it's the case that it takes water out of the system. Yes, farming returns water to the water cycle, but I can tell you that the clouds do not follow the plow. The water, it sends it somewhere else. So I think it's a really interesting problem that arid and semi-arid places are going to have to grapple with. And I'm no chemist, but I have been told by folks who are experts on this that what happens after the electrolysis is the molecules go off and create new water molecules. So you can have closed system hydrogen production, for example, at a factory where the byproduct of the electrolysis is water.
That's a very helpful comment. Thank you. Thank you. Well, there are probably people who don't feel I've done justice to their question, but I believe that I have touched on and tried to present all the questions that have come in so far. Do any of you out there have additional questions you'd like to pose? We could go another 8 or 9 minutes, I guess. It's 6 to 9 minutes maybe. But if we have pretty much come to the end of the questions, we might be drawing to a close. Let's just give you a few more minutes to, not minutes really, but maybe 20 or 30 seconds to think about whether you want to type some additional questions to be posed to our panel. I'm not, yeah, here's one. I have a couple. What is the reality of water rights under a future in which we have less and less water? And well, may I initially respond? Where there are priorities in place, of course, the whole system assumes that people with lower priorities will forbear on the use of their water right. I mean, they'll just have to not use it because people who have senior priorities have first claim to the use of the resource. So in theory, some people may be unable to use a water right that exists, but there's not enough water to satisfy it. And that is expected to happen, I think, actually, where the law of prior appropriation prevails. Another thought that comes to my mind is there are loud voices that would say, in the interest of equity and the interest of, I don't know, maximizing the benefits to the greatest number of people, something of that nature, we really just ought to abandon the law of prior appropriation. It's increasingly being questioned by people who don't have recognized water rights. I don't know how far that's going to go, but of course, people who live in cities have votes, lots of votes. They can put together a lot of capital. They can influence politics, but they can also influence the application of technology to some extent to try to stretch the use of the resource. So our urban areas are going to be very much a part of water discussions for the ongoing future. And so I turn now to other panelists to see whether you have other comments about the reality of water rights where we have less and less water.
Yeah, I'd like to riff on something that you said. I've always thought one of the strengths of prior appropriation is that it squarely determines who bears the risk for unforeseen circumstances, and that can be a good thing. I think the only other viable alternative to prior appropriation is some system, is basically what is being done in Australia, where you get entitlements, and then there's a pretty clear system to determine how they're going to be curtailed in times of shortage. I agree with the others. Equity is not very helpful because everybody claims that. So you're either going to have adapted to prior appropriation, which you have. It's going to put more risk on junior users, which are actually usually not farmers. That's going to be mainly cities, but or you're going to there are a lot of Australians that would like to sell the Australian system to the United States, but as far as I know, there really haven't been too many takers yet. But I think those are the only two real competing models out there for the future of water rights.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think the jury is out on the Australian system. It's really interesting, but there are lots of developments that I think should prompt some critical questions about the Australian system. The prior appropriation is really a law of economic security or certainty for water users. It allocates the risk of shortage in a sort of orderly way so that junior users can be prepared for shortage. And it's not, I appreciate what you say about adaptation to prior appropriation, because I think that is the place where we could take a look. Is it too hard to transfer a water right? Are there types of exchanges that would happen but are impeded by the current system that we have, the sort of modified Colorado Basin version of prior appropriation, I think there are. I think there could be room, for example, only within agricultural users in the whole Colorado Basin, only ag users. You could consider allowing ag water users who have experienced a cut to be permitted to purchase water from another ag user who has not experienced a cut across the basin. That would be an adaptation that might ensure that water goes to its highest and best use. The one difference, the big difference between cities and agriculture, I just want to make this final point, is that cities have the capacity to adapt much more than agriculture. They have more money, they have the ability to reclaim water, they have the ability to manage demand in very creative ways. And I think the question of a future of less and less water, cities to me come out as having more tools, more ability to adapt, and it's farms that I worry about.
Yeah, thank you. One last question, and we may not have an answer, but the question is, does anyone know the latest on the Columbia River Treaty between Canada and USA?
I don't know if there'll be an answer in my lifetime.
Okay, that sounds familiar. All right, well, listen, I want to thank you all for joining us. Professor Tarlock, it's been a special treat to see you again after some passage of time. Matt, I absolutely love your story, and I predict you will have an opportunity to tell it many times over. And Sarah, I can't say enough about what the Kyle Center has done for the people of Arizona and for the West in general. Thank you for all of that and for your future efforts to bring some clarity to the policymaking process. Obviously, as people like to say, you can't make good policy without facts, and the Kyle Center is producing the facts that people need to take into account. So thank you for that, and I will turn it back to Martha.
Sure. Thank you, Richard. And thank you to all of our speakers for the insightful discussion today. I'd also like to thank all of you in the audience for joining us and submitting your questions. We appreciate your engagement with us and would love to hear your feedback. So please take a moment to share your comments about today's session in the brief survey you will see at the conclusion of this forum. As I mentioned at the beginning of the forum, Farm Foundation is celebrating our 90th anniversary this year. You're all invited to celebrate with us in Chicago this June 15th at the Drake Hotel for an unforgettable evening of special programming, including announcing the winners of the 2023 Farm Foundation Awards. You can learn more about the awards and the gala on our website at the link being posted in the chat. If you'd like to help us continue to provide valuable programming, such as today's forum, I'll quickly remind you about becoming a friend of Farm Foundation. Check the link provided in the chat to learn more. Each and every gift of Farm Foundation strengthens our ability to address rapidly evolving issues impacting agriculture, the food system, and rural communities, and we are so grateful for your support. Thank you once again for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you at a future event.